we've got a new triage tool that we're launching today, and something that Rachel's developed over the last year or so, I guess. So I will hand over to Rachel to tell us all about it.
I'm going to just talk through the new triage tool that we've developed at Foundations. Just give you a little bit of background as to how we've developed it. And we've also got a presentation from an occupational therapist in Leicestershire that's piloted it as well. The triage tool is about making the best use of, or really ensuring that the right person is doing and providing that guidance around what is necessary and appropriate as part of that DFG application. Now, I don't want to make this all about occupational therapists, but obviously one of the driving factors for us developing the tool has been around access to occupational therapists as part of that assessment for what's necessary and appropriate. I think what's really important is just to really quickly just look at how things have changed for occupational therapists in social care, and perhaps why the access to an occupational therapist isn't perhaps as easy as it was back in 1996 when you know, we first had the DFG and the legislation underpinning that. So I've just provided on this slide just a reminder of the key things that have happened for occupational therapists in social care. One of the critical things that has changed is obviously we had the Care Act introduced nearly 10 years ago now, which amalgamated a number of pieces of legislation, and you know, the Care Act really shapes in terms of how we work as occupational therapists in social care, and our role in supporting people in terms of their care needs, and preventing, reducing, delaying people developing health and social care need. The other thing that has happened is many of the assessments that used to happen in hospitals by occupational therapists now have shifted out into the community. So a number of assessments that would have been done in hospitals no longer happen there, rightly so. The hospital's not the right environment to assess somebody in terms of what they're required to keep them independent at home. But what that does mean is that many more assessments have shifted out into the community, and there hasn't necessarily been the same shift out in the community in terms of those resources that were in the hospital. We haven't necessarily seen that shift of OTs working out in the community. Obviously, during the pandemic, one of the biggest changes has been discharge to assess. Again, kind of building on the work that had started around moving resources out of hospital. Obviously now, as soon as somebody is medically optimised, they're on a pathway out of the hospital. And again, what that has meant is that a number of those assessments are now being undertaken by social care occupational therapists. A new kind of policy that is impacting on occupational therapists is urgent care response, this idea where we're providing that immediate response to avoid hospital admission. Again, you've got occupational therapists in social care being pulled into a number of those teams. Alongside that, we've been driven by the Care Act is this idea that we use that strength-based approach and that asset-based approach to meeting people's needs, equipment, adaptations, advice, all the kind of key stuff that we do as occupational therapists, again, are really useful resources in terms of you know, not having to use more expensive home care resources. But what that does mean is that the need for occupational therapists is even in more demand around assessments and looking at solutions. And obviously on top of that, we've got that ageing population and complexity of people's situations. So I think it's just useful to highlight those key factors, because I think it just reminds ourselves, both within social care, housing, kind of the demand for occupational therapy. On top of that, what we've also got, not only have we got that landscape, is that we've also, as with technical officers and other practitioners, professionals, we've got a workforce issue within occupational therapy. So a huge amount of posts out there that are vacant. Many of those posts are vacant within social care because of the discrepancy around NHS colleagues. So an NHS occupational therapist often is paid more than a local authority occupational therapist. Obviously, kind of attracting occupational therapists in local authorities more challenging. And what that basically means is that we've got far too much demand in terms of the supply of occupational therapists in local authority. So again, it just kind of builds that picture in terms of the work that we're involved with sometimes around our adaptations, why there is often an issue around getting those assessments for an occupational therapist. So what we do know, because of the kind of pressures and needing to make best use of occupational therapy resource, is what we know is that we need to change the way that we do things. And this was kicked off a couple of years ago with the publication of Adaptations Without Delay that was published by the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, which basically said, look, we need to make better use of resources, particularly around adaptations. And actually, you know, we could be doing things differently. You don't need an occupational therapist to necessarily be involved in an adaptation where the situation is relatively simple. And obviously in other areas of health, social care, triage tools are often used as that way of making better use of resources and ensuring that the right people are involved in working with an individual. So we know that triage is used successfully in other areas of health and social care. So that's obviously underpins why we thought about developing a triage tool to support the work that had started within Adaptations Without Delay. So just really quickly, this is a definition of what a triage tool. So obviously it's a tool that helps conduct a preliminary assessment in order to determine the urgency of their need for treatment and the nature of the treatment required. So our foundation's adaptations triage tool determines the skills, knowledge required to provide guidance around what is necessary and appropriate in terms of that DFG application. We've had a little bit of debate. I think sometimes calling it an assessment for what is necessary and appropriate. I think sometimes the word assessment is used a lot, and I think sometimes we confuse, certainly when we start talking about occupational therapy, we can confuse the assessment that the occupational therapist is doing as part of their statutory duty under the Care Act legislation, and then the assessment which is around looking at what is necessary and appropriate. And I think sometimes it's really important to separate out those two functions because they are very separate functions. So that's why I've called it, rather than calling it assessment around what is necessary and appropriate, is what we're actually doing is providing guidance to our housing colleagues around what is necessary and appropriate as part of that DFG application. Because as we all know, it's still the grant officer's responsibility in determining what is necessary and appropriate. They're liaising with the welfare authority to get guidance on actually, what would be the right thing in terms of a necessary and appropriate adaptation. So this slide just really quickly just provides an overview, and I will go into a little bit more detail behind the journey that we've been on over the past couple of years developing the triage tool. But it just provides an overview that obviously it's not something I've just sat down on one afternoon and pulled together. We have gone through a fairly rigorous process to develop the tool. The first thing that we've done is we've used the Adaptations Without Delay to structure that idea around, who needs to be involved in the assessment. We've used the work of Elizabeth Ainsworth and Desley de Jong from Australia, who have done a lot of research around what makes adaptations complex in terms of the different elements of the process. So we've used their work to help structure the questions around the adaptations without delay framework. From that piece of work, about 18 months ago, we developed an initial triage tool, and Foundations hosted a national workshop to get feedback from the sector around those initial first set of questions. So if you were involved with that workshop, a huge thank you for your feedback. And I've got a slide just to say what we did following that feedback. We've then, I think it was middle of last year, we started to work with the University of Salford and students there to help start taking the work forward with those questions. And we, through an iterative process, got the triage down to 4 questions. And what we've been doing over the last few months is piloting the triage tool with a small number of occupational therapy teams. So I'll just provide a little bit more detail in terms of the development of the tool. So as I say, we've used the adaptations without delay framework to help us think about, okay, what are the types of cases that don't need an occupational therapist, what kind of cases perhaps could be dealt with through an OT assistant, a trusted assessor, and then actually what are those real crucial cases where it really does help to have an occupational therapist provide guidance around what adaptations are necessary and appropriate. So that's how we've used the framework to help our thinking around, okay, what could be done through a self-supported assessment, what could be done through trusted assessor model, and what could be done through having a more targeted, more specialist approach and involvement by an occupational therapist. As I say, the first iteration of the triage tool actually had 9 questions, and the feedback that we got from the workshop was that it really needed to fit into a different models and different ways the DFG process happens in local authorities. Again, the tool needed to support the OT's role that they have under the Care Act legislation, as well as the support that they provide housing colleagues under their responsibility under the housing legislation, the DFG legislation. There was also a request to have clarity around actually who should administer the tool, and actually what skills do you need to, administer the triage. And there was a feeling that there was too many questions and how actually relevant some of the questions were. So with as I say, we worked with the University of Salford and the students there to do some fine tuning of the tool. And what we did is we got the questions down to 4. We hopefully have made the questions simpler, and we've done some work to develop a very simple manual that sits alongside the triage tool. And as I said, the students helped start some real world testing and piloting of the tool as well. So we've got, as I said, we've got an interview at the end of the presentation with an OT that's been piloted in Leicester. But what I want to do is just actually take you through the tool itself before we move on to that interview. So here I've got a slide that just provides some assumptions around using the tool. So one of the assumptions is that the tool is administered by a competent occupational therapist or a competent trusted assessor, because obviously it's about understanding the answers that you're getting back from the triage tool and the relevance of those answers in terms of determining who needs to be involved. The other assumption is that it's not just the triage tool itself, it's also around having the kind of structures in place to support, you know, if an OT isn't necessarily involved in looking at what's necessary and appropriate, have you got the right workforce skills and operational structures in place to enable whoever is doing the assessment to do the assessment. So that idea of having that trusted model in place as well. The other thing as well is about the person just being aware that if an OT isn't doing an assessment as part of their statutory duties under the Care Act, just about perhaps making the person aware that actually that assessment is part of the DFG application and not a Care Act assessment, so that they're clearly aware that that if an OT isn't involved, then it may not be that it's not a Care Act assessment. I hope I've explained that well. But if you've got questions, you can ask me those at the end. So this is the triage tool itself. So we do have screening questions, which you may not need depending on whether you have a front door service that does this screening for you to ensure that the adaptations is the right route for the individual. So this is why we've got screening questions before the main tool, and it's just about ensuring that the person gives consent to be triaged and has the capacity to participate in the triage process. The other three questions on the screening just ensure that we've got the person on the right pathway in terms of actually adaptations is the right pathway, and we don't need to perhaps look at reablement, or that the actual person perhaps needs a review by the GP just to check that they're okay, or whether actually we need to be looking at advice or equipment. So that's why we've got screening questions. Many local authorities tend to have this in place, but for those areas where you don't have that in place, then that's why we've got these screening questions there, just to ensure that we know that the DFG and adaptations is the right pathway for the individual. So part two, as I say, we've got 4 triage question. Each question has either a green, orange or red response. If one or more response is red, then that indicates that an assessment by an occupational therapist is probably needed in terms of providing guidance around what is necessary and appropriate. If one or more response is yellow and there are no reds, then that suggests that either a competent OT assistant or a trusted assessor is needed to support identifying what is necessary and appropriate. And then if all 4 responses are green, then this could indicate that a supported self-assessment or remote assessment might be an appropriate route for that individual. So let's have a look at the questions. I'm sorry if this is really small. Hopefully you can see that. We'll provide a link where you can actually get the triage tool for. So question 1, I've just provided a little bit of detail about what each question is considering in terms of complexity. So what you'll see in black is the actual question, and then you've got those responses under the green, yellow and red. So I'll let you have a read of that. But in terms of question 1, what we're thinking about here is we're considering the complexity of the person's current and future condition and the implication that might have on their long-term health and social care needs. In this question, we're also thinking about the person's processing skills, their cognitive skills, and whether that might also have an impact on the type of adaptation that should be recommended. So perhaps thinking about, if somebody has got processing, say if they've got dementia or cognitive impairment, some adaptations may need to be carefully considered to ensure that we don't install something that puts them at risk. So that is what question 1 considers. Question 2, this looks at what types of activity is the person having difficulty doing. Again, the responses fall under those red yellow or green responses. And what question 2 is doing is thinking about, as it says there, the complexity of the activities that the person is struggling to do. The idea being, if the person is struggling to perform a number of activities in different areas of the home, then that makes that assessment and unpicking what is necessary and appropriate that much more complex. And that's where you get value of having an OT involved, because in terms of the skill of the OT to look at that complexity of those more complex activities happening in the home environment. The third question. So this one is there any anticipated needs around additional equipment or care or support that might be needed once the adaptation is installed? Again, the idea being that if it's anticipated that a person might need equipment or care involvement, then that makes it more complex, because it's about thinking about the impact around what you're recommending as being necessary and appropriate, and unpicking that. So question 3 considers the complexity of the care needs of the individual and any current or future equipment, so we can ensure that we've got compatibility and we take into account the carer's needs when we're recommending what adaptations might be necessary and appropriate. And then question 4, final question, is there any indications that the adaptations will impact on anyone else living or using the property? Again, what we're thinking about is the complexity and the impact of any potential adaptations might have on others living and using the property. Again, if you have got a multi-generational family, it just increases that complexity of understanding what might be necessary and appropriate, and making sure that what you do for one person in the home doesn't have a negative impact on somebody else living in the home. And again, having an OT involved with those much more complex cases just helps unpick that. Whereas if you've just got somebody living alone, where there's not likely to the adaptation is not likely to impact on anybody else, then obviously that makes that situation much more simpler, as it were. So hopefully that just gives you an overview of the triage tool. As I say, we'll provide a link as to where you can download the simple manual and the tool, but we've also designed a quick reference version that Paul will bring up hopefully on the next slide. Yeah, so this is a condensed version of the tool that's in the manual, and that hopefully you can kind of download, and the idea being it might be something that you could have next to you on the phone or up on the wall. So I'm just wondering, Paul, have we got time for questions? Have any questions come through? I've not been keeping my eye on the chat.
Let's have a look. There's a couple of people asking about how you become qualified as a trusted assessor. Right.
So there are a number of courses that provide trusted assessor training. So, for example, DLF provide trusted assessor training. I think their details, they're on our website, aren't they, Paul?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one other comment about, I suppose, kind of the role of the kind of OT or assessor in necessary and appropriate, and where that fits in with reasonable and practicable.
So the triage tool has focused on looking at what is necessary and appropriate. So the role of the welfare authority is around providing guidance around what is necessary and appropriate. The reasonable and practicable bit obviously is a decision that the grants and the technical officers make that decision. And again, ultimately the grants officer has the overall say around what is necessary and appropriate anyway.
I think so. I think the big bit is that the reasonable and practicable is a fairly limited question, because it can only relate to the age and condition of the dwelling. Yeah. So in most cases, it's if the house is relatively well maintained, then it doesn't even come into play. So it's quite a limited question these days.